morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here. And my name is Paolo Falco. I work for the OECD in the Directorate for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. And in particular, I work on a project called The Future of Work. And today I'm here to sort of set the scene for the discussion by providing you some insights into this study, into the first results of this study, which is very much ongoing. And hopefully, by doing so, I will provide some food for thought that we can use later on today. And the idea is really to give you a sense of how the labor market, which for an association that works with managers is essentially the play field, is changing as a result of a number of what we call megatrends. Now, what do we have in mind when we think about megatrends? We have essentially in mind a combination of different forces that are very much shaping the world of today, and I'm sure you'll recognize them. Think of them as a combination of technology, which first and foremost is changing the way that the labor market works, globalization, which is to be considered just openness to the world in the form of trade, in the form of mobility of labor, and so on, and the two very much interact. And third, and by all means these are not the only arrows of change, these are not the only factors that we should keep in mind, but they are the ones that we concentrate on: aging societies. The fact that we have societies that are growing older, at least in the developed world, and this is having major impacts on the labor market. So this project, so far, tries to interact these different trends and look at how the labor market is changing as a consequence. When I say that these are by no means all that we should care about, you should think easily, you can think about other reasons the labor market is changing. There is climate change, there is sheer changes in the values that people attach to different types of work, taste for greater flexibility that is coming into the picture. What we try to do is essentially build a picture, build a set of analyses that we try to keep contained as much as possible, and that's why we focus on these megatrends. And in particular, what we look at is how these three forces are changing what jobs will be created, what jobs will be destroyed, how, where, and by whom these jobs will be performed in the future. This is very much an ongoing activity that was launched by our Secretary General, which you can see down here in the picture, at the beginning of last year, with a forum at the OECD on the future of work. Let's begin by giving you a little bit of statistical insight into how these megatrends are evolving. Let's begin with technology. One piece of the puzzle that is changing very much, and one that strikes many people, is the advancements of robotics. Robots are becoming more prevalent in the labor market. We see in this picture that from 2003 to 2015, the production of robots globally has increased by threefold, and it's very much speeding up. From about 80,000 robots produced in 2003 to already 250,000 in 2015. And these are robots for industrial use, obviously. Populations are aging, and this is perhaps the most striking element of the picture, albeit one that we are still in the course of developing in our analysis, and of which I will talk about a bit less today. The dependency ratio of our societies, and these are numbers that are relatively easy to project because we know who is in the labor force, we know longevity, these things don't change that fast, and therefore it's quite reasonable to assume that these kind of numbers will indeed pan out in reality, is about to double. 2050 doesn't seem too close, it's not too far either, but in about 30 years we will go from a dependency ratio of 25%, which means 25% of the labor force above working age per, so one adult in four will be a dependent of those working, to about half. And this is a very, very big change. And finally, no need to tell you, this is perhaps the least new of our findings. Well, none of this is particularly new, but probably the one that will even more easily ring the bell is the fact that the world is incredibly integrated and becoming more so. About 30% of jobs in the world, and Sweden here features particularly highly in the picture, depend on foreign demand. So the jobs that exist in a given labor market, on average, 30% of them depend on the fact that we trade with the outer world. Now, taking these megatrends in mind, in our project we have explored a number of questions related to the labor market. And in particular today, I'm going to focus on two. Let's begin with the first one. The first question is phrased as, what can we expect from the fourth industrial revolution? This is a bit of an obscure way and perhaps more too general way of putting a much more simpler question I'm going to discuss in a minute, which is, are we all going to be unemployed because robots are going to take our jobs? And this is something that very many people are worried about these days. And you might have seen, in particular, some particularly bleak prospects painted by an analysis that was produced a few years ago by some academics at the University of Oxford, who came out with a number that has made the headlines around the world of 47% of American jobs about to be destroyed by automation in 1 or 2 decades. Now, what do we do in our work? We have taken the results of that same study, which is based on understanding by experts in the evolution of technology of what different technologies can and cannot do. And instead of looking at jobs as a whole, we have tried to look at the details of what every person does in their job, dividing a job down into tasks. And what we find is that once you look at the details of what people do, and you don't just look at aggregate occupational categories, you find out that even in jobs that appear to be largely automatable, there are still bottlenecks, you could call, from the point of view of the engineers. For us humans, perhaps, is actually not a bottleneck, it's something extremely valuable, which are ultimately linked to creativity, interpersonal skills, human capacities that are not inherently or not yet simply automatable. And once you look at that, you find that actually the picture isn't as bleak as painted in that study. We find numbers in the range of around 10% of jobs that will be automated in the next couple of decades. Personally, I don't think this is the most interesting question we should be asking, though. The question is not really how many jobs will be destroyed or will not be destroyed. And I think the next part of the analysis shows that quite clearly. Even if only 10% of jobs may be destroyed, our work, which shows estimates that are a bit more conservative than the Frey and Osborne study, definitely reveals that a large chunk of the labor market, these blue bars, on average 25% of jobs, even if they will not disappear completely, they will change substantially as a result of technology. And by changing substantially, I mean that between 50 and 70% of the tasks that people will be doing will be radically changed, because possibly they will be automated. The jobs will still be there, but the human part will be dedicated to other tasks that workers may not be prepared of yet. What are the tasks going to be? Well, the ones that are most easily automatable, as you probably know already, and this again emerges from the analysis, are the ones at the bottom, and are the ones that are most mechanical. The ones that just relate to simple exchange of information, simple buying and selling, simple dexterity. The ones that are least automatable are the ones that are due to human skills. So things to do with interpersonal capacities, presenting to others, influencing others, reading, writing creatively, and so on. And I'd like to pause on this for a second, because, if you will, this helps me also answer the question that was posed at the beginning of the seminar. What is leadership? Based on this, well, I would say leadership is creativity. Leadership is what the human mind can do that is inherently impossible for a pre-programmed machine to do. And this is something that I personally think will pan out as becoming part of the lives of workers at all levels of the labor market. I think we're moving towards a labor market that is not necessarily going to be one where there are managers and there are workers anymore, but a lot and a lot more, many workers will acquire some managerial capabilities in their day-to-day activities, because they will need to make themselves a lot more relevant in the labor market, and decision-making of a managerial kind is precisely the kind of thing that involves the creativity, the human capabilities, the teamwork that machines are inherently unable to do. as of now. Obviously, the picture could change going forward. Now, having said all this, there is something to be kept in mind, which is that technological progress is not inevitable. What does this mean? It means that policy plays a role, that tastes play a role, that what people think play a role, and therefore we should not necessarily think that the predictions of the analysis that I've just shown you are going to be true because technology is unstoppable. And this, I think, can be shown very easily by perhaps one piece of evidence, which is this one, which tells you what are the preferences, in fact, what are the attitudes that people have towards robotics. And what do you find? You find that while in sectors like space exploration and manufacturing, people are, easygoing about letting robots in, for all that is education, care, healthcare, leisure, even if technology could do a lot of the jobs, people are not necessarily going to want someone to take care of them while they're sick that is not a someone but is a something. So this is to say that when we often hear about this discourse, and it's something I'd like to leave with you because it's useful to keep in mind, we are falling easily into the fallacy of thinking in technologically deterministic terms, which is to say, because the technology exists, it will reach a certain level of spread, and therefore things will happen. That's not necessarily true. Second question I want to explore with you today, also coming out of the analysis, is the one that is also very much interesting a lot of policymakers in the world, which, loosely speaking, can be put as follows. If jobs are disappearing in certain parts of the economy, is it because of technology or is it because of globalization? Is it the robots or is it low-cost manufacturing in developing countries? Why is this important? Well, you can look everywhere in the world, and in particular at recent political campaigns. Take the US campaign, take the Brexit campaign to some extent, take many others campaigns that have been run recently, the French campaign, and you'll see that politicians, a lot of the time, talk about these two words. They talk about technology stealing jobs, destroying jobs, or they talk about globalization being responsible for losses of jobs. And the implication of the second part is, let's close our borders, let's close to the outer world, and let's then take the jobs back. The analysis that we've run at the OECD tries to answer this question by essentially using empirical methods to tease out the explanation for some important changes in the labor market. So we put together data on technology with data on globalization, and we try to look at changes in the industrial and occupational structure of countries as a result of these two forces. The first element we look at is deindustrialization. What do I mean by that? Well, the fact that many advanced economies, most advanced economies, are experiencing a fall in manufacturing relative to other parts of the economy. Why is this important? Why do we care? Well, because in advanced economies, manufacturing has very much been the backbone of the economy. It's been the backbone of the middle class. It's been what the success of most advanced economies has been built on. And we see it shrinking, and that causes a lot of anger, a lot of anxiety, a lot of worrying that middle class jobs are going. Now, this is certainly true. You can see from this graph that wherever you look at in the manufacturing sectors, the blue bars, jobs have been lost. The sector has been shrinking, whereas increases in employment have occurred in the service sector. Now, overall, employment has grown. Let's keep that in mind. But it certainly moved from what were jobs in the manufacturing sectors that typically were middle-skilled, widely available to a relatively educated but also not too educated class of workers that very much have formed the middle class of our industrial societies, in favor of jobs that are in the sector of services, which tend to be a lot more divided into low-skilled and high-skilled jobs. And I'll get to that in a minute. Indeed, what I mean by that is that the labor market, partly as a consequence of deindustrialization, is polarizing. What does polarization mean? It means that partly as a consequence of going from manufacturing to services, but also more generally as a consequence of other changes in societies, what we find is that middle class jobs, the ones that require middle level of skills, pretty much everywhere you look, have been decreasing, while the ones that have been increasing are the ones that have high skill content or low skill content. Now, what does this mean? What do we care? Well, why do we care? Again, because this is historically the middle class of industrial societies. It's the workers in factories, it's the middle level management, it's the people that have very much formed the backbone of industrial Europe, of the United States, and are the people that are angry these days because these jobs have gone. You could say, well, if they all go to the high skill sectors, what's the big deal? You know, they're upskilling, better for them. That's true to some extent. The problem is that as a result of these trends, we see a lot more inequality in the economy. When I say as a result of these trends, I'm obviously overplaying them a little bit. This is not the only force behind raising higher and higher inequality, but certainly the two may well be linked, and this is something that should worry us. Inequality is increasing pretty much anywhere, and so is polarization of the types that I've told you. So the picture I've painted in this second part of the analysis is one of the manufacturing sector decreasing, middle class jobs being lost, polarization having grown, inequality potentially having grown as a result, and you can summarize all this in a lot of growing anxiety, anger, unsteadiness that is leading to the kind of rejections of the status quo, and among other things, to the kind of anger towards technology on one side and globalization on the other side that you see throughout the world. So we think it's important to ask the question, which one of these is it that has created...
Just a question.
Yes.
How do you see the picture in Norway and in the United States? Because they are very
Of
different.
course. Yeah, unfortunately I didn't have time to comment on it, but this picture is to say that even in countries with relatively low inequality historically, I didn't have a chance to put Sweden on, but the picture isn't too different from the countries with relatively low levels of inequality. Inequality is going up. So even in places like Norway that we might not expect to catch up with the United States anytime soon, but the picture is one of trending inequality upwards. Now, the big question, so what is it? Well, the Employment Outlook 2017, which has just been published, in one of its chapters finds that it's predominantly about technology. So if there is one force among these two that shows a clear correlation with what's happening in the labor market, is technological progress. And the implication of this is that closing ourselves to the outer world, cultivating this fantasy that curbing trade, putting barriers, closing borders will bring back jobs, is probably just a fantasy. Because even if we were to close the borders, there will probably be a lot of automation having already occurred by then that will prevent the jobs that were the metal worker jobs, the middle skill jobs, the ones in factories that now use robots or technology that doesn't require as much labor as before, from creating these jobs again, from increasing employment in those sectors. So this is the empirical picture so far. Going forward, the project will explore more issues and more elements of the analysis. One of them, which I'm going to quickly touch upon and just tell you about it, is the fact that work is becoming a lot more flexible, fragmented, and this is exemplified by the fact that the so-called gig economy, the platform economy, the work-on-demand economy is increasing. This is very much on our mind, and one of the next pieces of analysis we're going to produce is going to be about understanding what are the implications of this for workers. And in particular, we're going to be asking if these usual suspects, and this is a very outdated list by now, I'm sure there are a lot more, are creating greater income efficiency and flexibility, so good for workers, or and if both, which one is the predominant element? Less social protection, greater precarity, and greater risks that ultimately result in lower welfare for workers. So stay tuned, this will be forthcoming. For the time being, I just wanted to mention. And what I'm going to do in the last part of the presentation, just to conclude, is to leave you with a feel for what are the policy measures that one can think about when discussing these kinds of problems and how to tackle them. And what we have in mind is a picture that embraces very much the whole set, or almost the whole set, of labor market policies that we typically deal with. You can, broadly speaking, think of them as divided in these 5 categories, ranging from skills to social protection, labor market regulation, activation policies, and collective bargaining. Somewhere in the picture as well, this is something that our colleagues in the tax directorate deal with, but we obviously deal with it when thinking about social protection, is taxation, and how progressive taxation should be, and how taxation should move from labor to capital. But this is an issue that would require a separate discussion, and we're not necessarily going to touch upon here. In fact, I'm not going to touch upon the whole 5 areas, obviously, for conciseness. What I'm going to tell you briefly is what we've been working on in the areas of skills and social protection so far. So in the areas of skills, to begin with, one that is very much important to the kind of work that you do in your organizations is, given the changes in the labor market that we're experiencing, so the advancements of technology, the changes in the jobs that are available, how prepared are the workers as of now for the labor market of the future? The OECD has a survey called the Survey of Adult Skills, also named PIAC, that is a survey of adults in the labor market, which, among other things, tests how good workers are at a number of tasks in certain skills. And one skill that is particularly relevant for what we are discussing today is problem-solving skills in technology-rich environments. A long way of defining something relatively simple. How good are workers at solving simple problems, carrying out simple tasks using computers? And what we find is a particularly worrying picture, that 50% or more of workers, pretty much wherever you look in the OECD, even in Scandinavian countries, and you can see the Sweden tops list here, where the proportion of workers with good skills, the bars above 0, is particularly high. Even in those countries, there is a good chunk, this 50% or more at the bottom, that have little to no ability to use computers to solve simple problems. So before we even worry about what kind of fancy technologies are going to come out in the future, we should realize that we have about half of the labor force that can barely do anything with some basic technology at all. And then the follow-up question, obviously, is how good are we at filling these gaps? How well are we doing in providing the workers who need education with the education that will fill those knowledge gaps? Well, the answer is that we're not very good and we're not doing very well. What this graph shows is the percentage of workers that receive on-the-job training by prior level of abilities. So based on how good they are to begin with, which in this case is proxied by their level of literacy, what percentage of them receives training? And what we find is that the system, and this might sound unsurprising to you, but it is worrying, is doing more or less the opposite of what it should be doing. The workers in orange are the ones that are already best, most proficient, most stable, most literate, and they're also the ones that receive most training. The ones in blue, who are the ones that are less literate, who are least able, who would need more help, receive the least. This is obviously one part of the system. It's about on-the-job training. It's got a big component of private sector involvement. It's not necessarily public schemes, but it's one way of looking at it, and it's particularly stark. And in the last couple of minutes I've got left, what I want to tell you is what's the general feel that we have for how social protection is prepared for the future work. So we've talked about skills, we've talked about skill gaps and what can be improved there. Now I want to tell you, when it comes to instead giving workers the support that they need to navigate the labor market, and in particular to transition from different jobs, or to be supported in cases of unemployment, which is obviously the #1 risk that workers face. So in those cases, how well is the labor market equipped to help different types of workers cope? And what I'm going to do here in particular is focus on one category of workers, which many think is the category of workers of the future, the self-employed. The person that works for himself or herself, which you can think of as freelancer, gig economy worker, or simply the good old self-employed with a small business. What do we know there? And bear with me, this picture is a bit outdated by now. We're trying to develop some new estimates and compile a new version of it going forward. We have essentially a grid that tells us how the social protection for the self-employed compares to the social protection of regular workers in different OECD countries. And what we find here is that in most cases there are large differences. The self-employed range from having absolutely no benefit at all in areas that range from old age, invalidity, health, accidents, unemployment, and family, to having the same rules but in very scattered cases. These are the white boxes, and in most cases they just face different rules. This is to say that being in different categories in these labor markets can lead to yet more inequality, can lead to yet more unsteadiness, instability, and in particular, for what many consider the working category of the future, the self-employed, this is a picture that tells that labor markets very much need to be reformed to become a bit more homogeneous, to help people cope in these transitions and avoid that going into certain kinds of jobs may result in great uncertainty. And the last piece of evidence on this that I'm going to tell you comes from the European Commission, who tells that, in a recent survey, in a recent piece of analysis, tells us the state of social protection for the self-employed in Europe is again quite bleak. 55% almost of the share of self-employed in the EU are at risk of not being entitled to unemployment benefits. 38% of the share is the share of the self-employed that risk not being entitled to sickness benefits, and 46% is the share of self-employed women who are at risk of not being entitled for maternity benefits. Now you could say, why do we care so much about this? Well, as I said, because if the labor market becomes a lot more flexible, there is a lot more in and out of work and a lot more transitions across these different categories, this is just, if you will, a tale of what is happening more generally in the economy. This is a symbol, a symbolic representation, if you want, of the kind of heterogeneity and inequality of treatment that different workers face, and this results in a lot of uncertainty, and ultimately may result in a lot of wealth, in a loss of welfare, and important losses of welfare for workers that in this new economy need to move in and out, need to be more flexible, need to be more adaptable, and need to cope with change. Thank you.